right. Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Natanzon with Abundance Protocol. And today I want to talk about how blockchain technology can prevent dystopia and create an economy of abundance. So we have a lot of crises that we're dealing with today, and we can think of these, the reason we have these crises and why they're getting worse, as a problem with feedback loops and exponential technology. So if we think about what makes an effective feedback loop, we can think of markets, for example, and what makes markets effective feedback loops is that if you're doing something beneficial, there's an incentive that rewards you to keep doing it or improving on it. And if you're doing something harmful, there is an incentive for you not to do it. There's a cost to it. So if you're producing something in the market, you have customers. If they buy it from you, obviously you get the money back, and then you can reinvest it in whatever you're doing. You can improve it. You obviously want to create more of it to produce more. If you're producing something that harms people, they're not going to buy it. And if they don't buy it, then you don't get the money for it, and then you cannot, reinvest it in anything, so you don't want to do it. We don't have the same feedback loops for either negative externalities, which is things that are harmful to outside the market, or for public goods, which means if you're creating a product and that product harms others, whether it's through pollution or if you're a social media company and you're creating a toxic social environment, there's nothing really there that would put it as a cost on you. Instead, you're making the money, but there's no cost. And the same thing for public goods, which is basically there is no economic incentive for you to create more public goods because you don't get rewarded for it, so you're not going to make more of it. I mean, you might, but you're not getting the benefit from it. And if we put it together, if we put the externalities, the market, and public goods all together, we understand how this whole system works, that basically you have an effective feedback loop in the market, and you have an incentive to offset some of those costs through externalities, but you don't have an incentive to produce the public goods. You still might do it, but you don't have the economic incentive. If we add the exponential technology to it, then we can see why there's more externalities. Because now every little change you make, it can have an exponential effect, which means you're making more money in the market, but it produces more externalities. And that's where we are. But what we actually want is we want to have effective feedback loops and to reverse this process. We want to have an incentive to produce the public goods, and we want to have a disincentive to produce the negative externalities. So the question is, how can blockchain technology help in this process? How can it help create those effective feedback loops? So this kind of goes back to the 4 different quadrants of goods. So if we have private goods and club goods, there is effective feedback loops for them because they're excludable, which means you can create a market for them. You can sell something and then you get money in return, so there's effective feedback loops. For common goods or public goods, you don't have the same process. You produce something, but there's no way for you to capture that value. And if we think about it in terms of let's say a book, if you're creating a book and you're selling it in the market, then you can create a physical book and then it can be a private good. Or if you take the same content of the book and then you sell it online, then it can be a club goods, which basically means that people can either subscribe to you and then get the book, or the idea is that it's non-excludable in the sense that the content, many people can just view the same content. It's not restricted. And then you can take the physical book and donate it to, let's say, to a library, and then it becomes a common good because people can still only take it one at a time, and it also degrades over time because the more people use it, it degrades, so that becomes a common good. And you can take digital content and then make it available for everyone, and then it's a public good. Now, if we think about that book in those different quadrants, we can see how if it's a public good, it has the most impact because the most people, you need the least resources, and then the most people can access it, but you make almost no money or no money from it, versus if it's a physical book, you need to produce more of it, you need to kind of consume more resources, but that's how you can make a lot more money. And you can see, so in terms of impact, in terms of efficiency, you obviously want public goods, but we have a conflict now with how much profit you can make, and therefore, your own self-interest. So how do we change it? We change the profit to go into the impact? How do we make them in the same quadrant? So we can look at the different funding mechanisms we already have. We can look at the traditional ones and the crypto mechanisms. And in traditional terms, we have government, we have philanthropy, crowdfunding, and then all these, they still don't create these effective feedback loops that we're looking for. It's still, you take money from the left-hand quadrants. If it's government, you basically tax people, and then you take that money and you put it toward public goods or common goods. But there's no, the more you create the public goods, you're not going to have more money going toward that. In crypto, we have new mechanisms that enhance existing systems. So for example, quadratic funding, it's a much more effective way to distribute funds based on the interests of the community, but you still need this external source of funding for it. So it's still, you don't have the effective feedback loops. Retroactive funding is also, it's a new mechanism where the idea is that once a public good or common good already created the impact, then it's easier to assess the value of that impact and then reward it. But currently, we still don't have systems that fund it in an efficient, not an efficient way, but in a self-sustainable, there's no feedback loop there. You still have like optimism, you still use sequencers fees, which are in a sense like a private good. And then we have consensus mechanisms. And consensus mechanisms, there's different ones, of course, but that's the first mechanism that we see a self-sustainable loop created. We have a feedback loop where we have one common good, which is network security, and you can self-sustainably fund it in the sense that you don't need external funding from it. It comes from basically coin issuance through the protocol itself, and the reason you make it sustainable is if either you take the money back in a way, like you reduce the supply, so either the supply is fixed or reduced when you use the blockchain, or if there's growth in the demand for the blockchain, and then you can make it sustainable. But this only works for one specific common good, which is network security. But what we want is we want it to be effective for every common good or every public good. So if we look at the mechanisms we have right now in terms of their scale, we can see that the traditional mechanisms, if it's government, it's in the trillions, and then you have philanthropy or crowdfunding that's in the billions now. But crypto, it's still, for both quadratic funding and retroactive funding, it's still in the tens, hundreds of millions, but it's nowhere near where we need it to be. Consensus mechanisms, on the other hand, is over $1 trillion right now, because if we look just at Bitcoin and Ethereum, those two already managed to generate, for those providing the common good of network security, about $1 trillion in issued to them. So what we need is, how do we, taking what we have now, how do we make a system that works like the market, which is it's efficient and you have effective feedback loops, but that works for something that's a public good. And for that, we introduce something called value consensus. And the idea is to take a similar process like consensus mechanisms, but instead of the way consensus mechanisms work is basically you have one decision that nodes in the network have to make based on what a block proposer does. So a block proposer produces new block, and then the nodes in the network basically have to decide, did it follow the rules of the protocol, yes or no? And if it did, then you issue a reward from the protocol to that producer. But what we want is we want a mechanism that works like the market, which means that you have a contributor who creates a public good, and then an ecosystem rewards the contributor for that public goods based on the impact on the ecosystem. So you want to create a market around that. But how do you create a market for something that is a public good? Like you produce it, but there's no need for you to pay for it because it's already created. So the way it would work is because of repeated games. And the idea is that you reward the public good because you want more of it produced. You want more public goods produced. Not exactly the same one, but any other type of public good. And if you produce it in a way that you reward it, then you're going to have more public goods created for your ecosystem. And you want to maximize that because that creates the most impact in your ecosystem, which means you have the most economic opportunity when you're in that ecosystem. But you want to balance that with maintaining your currency value. So you don't want to overpay for the public good. And if you have both, then you can have an alignment of interests. And that's one of the key things you need to be able to reward public goods in a way that's credible and efficient. You need both data, because if you don't know the impact, then you don't know how to reward it. So you need the data, but you also need an alignment of interest within the ecosystem, because it doesn't matter how much data you have, if the ecosystem cannot agree on what value this product has for the ecosystem, then you cannot agree on how much it's worth and how much you reward it. But if you have both, if you have the alignment of interest, which is what we described now, and data, then you can have impact equals profits, and then you can create an effective feedback loop around it. And another way to look at it is if you under-reward the public good, then you're going to have less of it produced, which means the value of your currency is going to be not as high, versus if you overvalue it, then you're going to have users leaving the ecosystem. And if users leave the ecosystem, then also you're going to have less value for the token. But there is a Schelling point where you reward it accurately based on how much the ecosystem values this public good. And if you can do that, then impact equals profit for this ecosystem, and then you can have a mechanism that works. But that's just the tokenomics. There's still a lot of challenges of how do you actually do it. So you need to design a mechanism that's self-sustainable, which we already described what you would need for that. But how do you make it self-sustainable? Well, you need the currency value to be stable. And for that to happen, you need to credibly review the impact. And you need the system to be scalable, but to credibly review the impact, you need to have Sybil resistance and you need to have collusion resistance, which means that you cannot have a system where someone proposes a project and then the people who review it collude with them to just reward them, because then there's no credibility to the evaluation process. And you need scalability, which means that if you have maybe 5 projects in a system, everyone in the ecosystem can review it. That's not a big deal. What if you have 100 projects, 1,000 projects, 1,000,000 projects? How do you make this ecosystem work in a way that you can scale it? If you have everyone in the ecosystem reviewing every project, you cannot do it. So I'm not going to go through every single problem for the mechanism how to solve it. I can assure you that we have a solution. It's in a white paper, but I'll go through the major ones, which is the scalability and the credibility. So for the issue of credibility, we want retroactive funding, because that's when you go with retroactive funding, then you can basically reward a project based on the impact that's already created. But the way you do it is you want people rewarding it that are domain experts, and you also want ecosystem-wide people looking at the project, because every domain expert thinks that their domain is the most important one. But you don't need everyone in the ecosystem reviewing every project. All you need is the impact that the project is likely to create. You need expertise that's sufficient to review it. So if the project is only likely to create a little bit of impact, you don't need a lot of expertise. You can have like a little bit of expertise. And if it's likely to create a lot of impact, obviously you want a lot more expertise going towards reviewing it. And you want the people reviewing it to be randomly selected, so then you wouldn't have collusion between the proposers and the people who are reviewing it. So, but to have this efficient allocation of validators, of reviewers, for that you need prediction markets, which means you need an incentive for, just like you have in the market, incentive for people to look for the projects or the stocks that are likely to make the most money for them. You need incentives for people to look for projects in this system that are likely to have the most impact. That's number one, and also to review them accurately. And if you have an incentive to do that, and we describe it in the white paper, then you can have resources in the system going towards reviewing every project based on their expected impact, and then the whole system works. And that pretty much is a way to solve every one of the challenges for this ecosystem and for this mechanism to work. And again, I didn't describe all the issues, but it is in the white paper, and we can go from there. But once we have that, then you can have effective feedback loops for public goods, because then you can incentivize projects to contributors to create public goods and common goods in a way that you want them to maximize their impact on an ecosystem. And if there is an economic incentive, that would create this effective feedback loop. And at the same time, you have a disincentive to create negative externalities. So essentially, you solve both problems. There's actually more mechanisms within this protocol that allow you to disincentivize the negative externalities, but I'm not going to go into all of that now. So taking a step back, kind of how do you make this whole system seamless and intuitive for people to use? So you can really take a decentralized social media platform, and you can overlay it with the ability for people to review projects, and also with the ability to create data forms that allow easier review of the projects. And you incentivize that because that's also a public good that you're creating. And so you can have a system that's intuitive, that's seamless, because that's kind of part of how we interact with the world and also with people around us, through social media, at least online. And that's how we can have a system that's seamless, that's intuitive, and also has these effective feedback loops for public goods and negative externalities. And obviously, I didn't go through everything, but sorry about that. But we are releasing the Abundance Economy book today, and you can get it either through the QR code or in the link below. And that goes a lot deeper into how we can create the system, what kind of effects it has, and its benefits and so on, and how we can make it all work. Thank you, everyone. I'm Mike, and with the Abundance Protocol, and you can talk to me if you have any questions or if you want to help out later. Thank you.